Pleasure this evening to introduce to you our very famous here professor and doctor from Harvard University, actually graduate of Harvard, who came to us via Kingsport to the Middle East in 1950 and back into town. And I see he's much more Middle Easterner than he is from Kingsport, as he talks like all of us in the Middle East with his hands up in the air. And that's something we accultured him with. I hope he doesn't ever leave it, because it's much more, it comes from the spirit of the person to come out with all his hands out and with a lot of love with it. Professor and Dr. Leonard Graham is a native of Kingsport actually, but he lived in the Middle East for 35 years. And he is as much part of the Middle East as he is part of Kingsport. And without too much ado, I'd like to introduce him and introduce to you his lecture today. And it's going to be on modernization or modernizing education versus westernization of schooling in the Middle East.
Thank you. Maybe I better tie my hands behind me if I'm going to behave like those pictures. What I want to talk tonight about is modernizing education versus westernizing schooling. Notice the difference between education and schooling. Now, this is not a problem just in the Middle East. It's a problem all over the world. The Arabic language has two different words for modernizing and westernizing. But in English, we often use those words interchangeably or overlapping. So I make a very big distinction between the two for our purposes, so we'll understand what I'm trying to say about schooling and education. For westernizing schooling, I mean learning what is already known in information and skills. And this leaves you powerless to think for yourself if something new comes up. Then what I say, the way I define modernizing education is memorizing. Of course, you have to have a lot of facts, so you have to memorize some things, but also learning to use the thinking processes that empower you to be able to create the things that we have had or things new. And so this contrast between the powerlessness of just learning what's already written in a book or learning the skills that are already known versus the learning to use the thought processes that make it possible for you to create things that make you powerful enough to handle anything that comes to you. Now, all of us are going to face changing our lives drastically many times during our life. Most of you will have different jobs at least 4 or 5 times during your life. It may have the same, we may work for the same company, but your job will change. And you need to learn how to learn. You need to learn how to be able to change and to adapt to new things. And you can't do that by just memorizing what some people have already written. You need to learn the thought processes. Now, I'm going to talk tonight about 3 different periods in the history of Arabic education. First of all, the Arabs were very creative and very intellectually powerful very early after the Prophet's life. And it was even before they had formal education that they were being creative. Well, how did that happen? And we'll talk about that. Secondly, during the Abbasid period, when they began to formalize schooling, they had 3 streams of education. Religious education, and because it was revealed by God, you lecture, memorization, and testing. Lecture, memorization, and testing. Secondly, there was something called adab, or humanities, and the Arabs were the first to put together a broad general education with history and literature and philosophy and so forth, and call it humanities. And for humanities, they did research and discussion, particularly discussion, and we'll come back to that again and again. Third was called foreign studies. The foreign studies included medicine, sciences, mathematics, and foreign languages. And for that, they used the other methods, plus in empirical observation, very careful looking, and then inductive reasoning, not deductive reasoning, but inductive reasoning, looking around at all the examples and coming up with a new hypothesis and then trying it out. Inductive reasoning, without inductive reasoning, there can be no science. So that was the foundation of all science in the world, this inductive reasoning. And then, in addition to that, they used hands-on experimentation. Now, as long as the Arabs kept these three streams separate and kept those methods going, they were one of the most creative cultures in all of history. They gave us the decimal system, they gave us algebra, they gave us trigonometry, they gave us chemistry, they started us in physics, and all of this was during a period of great creativity between about 755 AD and about 1300 AD. Now, every Arab will tell you, rightly and honestly, we were once one of the greatest cultures in all of history. But then when they're telling you that, you can feel something twisting inside. Why aren't we great still? Why aren't we creative still? And yet, I don't know that anyone has studied that. That's been the study of my life, to try to figure out what went wrong. And that's one of the things I'd like to tell you about this evening. It seems to me that so long as the Arabs used open-ended discussions, that is, discussing things that had no exact answer. What's the meaning of beauty? What's the meaning of truth? What's the meaning of justice? These are questions that you can go on discussing forever, and everyone's opinion and everyone's idea is equally valid, provided, of course, they could back it up with some kind of reasoning and so forth. So as long as they did that, they were very creative. But after the Mongol invasion of Mesopotamia, which we now call Iraq, 7 out of the 9 million people were killed by the Mongols in 1 year. 7 million people in 1 year. And then after that, the people that got control of the education were dogmatists. They had all the truths in their hand, and they were insisting that people learn just what we already know, just what we say is the truth. And very soon, all of that intellectual power dumbed down. Very soon, they lost all of that creativity. So obviously, some of the things they did were very important for their creativity. Let's go back again and talk about what were those methods that they used. First of all, there was the memorization, which is necessary, from lecture, memorization, and testing. But then there was research and discussion. Then after that, empirical observation, inductive reasoning, and then hands-on experimentation. That is, putting your knowledge to real tests. As long as they did that, they were very creative. But in this period of the Abbasids, they did a great many things that the world's still using. Now, at that time, there was very little knowledge in the world. In the early days after Muhammad, a man could know all there was to know about Quran and Islam. He could also be a medical doctor. He could also know geology and mathematics, because, say, geology may take 3 months to learn because there was that much. Medicine took a couple of years. And so some of these people were not Renaissance men. They didn't know a little bit about several fields. They, in themselves, knew almost everything there was to know about almost everything there was. There was so little knowledge. Today, our information is multiplying about 10% a year. About every 10 years, all of the knowledge in the world doubles. So this is more than you could possibly know. When I was in college, and that was over 60 years ago, when I was in college, we studied all of chemistry together. Now you can't master even a small part of chemistry. So the knowledge is multiplying. But the methods that were used by the Abbasids to empower people to think are just as useful today as they were in the days when there was less information. The methods are still useful. I'm not telling you to learn exactly what they learned in the Abbasid period. I'm telling you to learn those methods that were used in that period. But now, why were they so creative in the very beginning? When before the prophet died, he said, search for truth, even if you have to go to China. Utlub al-ilm la fassin. Search for truth, even if you have to go to China. And by that he meant, don't be afraid to look for truth. Learn from everyone, learn from anyone. He also said, God loves the ink of scholars more than the blood of martyrs. I wish we could teach that today a little more broadly than we do. But as a result, when he died, he also said, every line in the Quran can be interpreted up to 7 ways. And also, he knew that they were going to collect all he had said, not when he was in prophecy, not when he was in a trance and receiving word from God by way of the angel Gabriel or Michael. When he was not in prophecy, they felt he's an exemplar. He's chosen by God as a prophet. Therefore, what he does is the way we should guide our lives. So they wanted to collect, and they collected 70,000 things he had said and done. Well, they certainly couldn't handle that, so they needed to pare that down. Eventually, they got down to 9,000. Then he had said, if there's something that comes up that's not covered by the Quran or by the things that I've said or done, then if the community together agrees on something, that will be a law also. And then after that, if there's nothing in any of those 3, then anyone who's a scholar of Islam can give an opinion, a fatwa. And so this Sharia law is the Quran first, the hadith, the sayings of the Prophet and doings of the Prophet, and third, the agreements that were made before 900, and then opinions made from analogy and inference from those sources. And that was the law which they were to live by. But now in these first 200 years, they argued and discussed and argued and discussed. They passionately cared. And this is important. Discussion doesn't help unless you really care about getting an answer, about learning something. So a discussion needs to have a passion with it, needs to have a really caring interest. And he said that after this, when they went out to find out how to do all of this, they did several things that turned out to be very educational. Let me list them for you. All Arabs will tell you that the reason they were so great is because they very early translated all of the great books of the world into Arabic. But it wasn't the information that made the Arabs great, because if the information would make you great, it would have made the Persians and the Greeks and the others as great as the Arabs were. But no one was as creative as the Arabs were, not even the Greeks. So I believe it wasn't the information in the books that caused the translation to make them educated. It was the process of translating. If you translate from of another language to your language on important concepts, serious concepts, it is very intellectually stimulating. Secondly, Arabic was a very ambivalent language. They loved poetry in which you could read it 7 or 8 different ways. They loved language, words could mean different things. Well, they were going to write law. You can't write law in a language that's not really concise and precise. So in disciplining the Arabic, they did a great deal of work that was very intellectually stimulating in disciplining Arabic so that they could write law. Third, they found that grammar has meaning. It's not just words in a language that convey meaning, it's the syntax, it's the way the words are put together that convey meaning as well. And fourthly, they wanted to find examples of the use of every word in the Quran. So they went and looked for words and they looked for meanings and so forth. And then they did intercultural studies because they, as I told you earlier, they knew many different fields. Each individual knew many different fields. And intercultural studies is very intellectually stimulating. You may have gotten the hint now that what I'm doing is telling you how the Arabs discovered liberal arts education or broad general education, because this was not done intentionally. They had no interest in education at all. They were doing this to canonize the Sharia law, the Islamic law. Then interdisciplinary and intercultural, and after that they studied history. They wrote history. This is before Ibn Khaldun, but later one of the greatest historians of all, Ibn Khaldun, was an Arab. Then they were very interested in problem solving, a lot of which they learned through mathematics. And after that, they honored scholars. They really honored scholars, and every time, every evening when the men got together to talk, anyone who had some interesting idea, they gave great honor to the person with ideas. Not to the one that could tell jokes, not to the one that could entertain them something, but the one who could come up with interesting ideas to interest the group. And last of all of this time they were passionately discussing. And they learned very early that the Greeks had developed discussing to a high level. They used rigor of thinking that they got from Euclid, the geometrist. They used Plato's deductive reasoning and his discussions. And they used Aristotle's inductive reasoning. Now, all of these were used by those Arabs in that first 200 years, and it was not educational at all. They didn't intend that to be educational. I want to emphasize that over and over. This was a byproduct of their trying to write the law. Now, the Arabs made a very big mistake. The early Muslims made a big mistake. In 900, when they reached an agreement, finally, on the Sharia law, they said it can never be changed. And then they did one thing really terrible. They pretended that this law was exactly the same as it had been the day the Prophet died in 632 AD. In other words, they erased all of the history of all this discussion, all this ferment. They wiped that out of their history because they had been very frightened. Let me tell you why. They were frightened by rationalists, by people who were saying that you could learn everything about religion by using your minds, by rational thinking. And these people were called Mu'tazili, or rationalists. In 813, the son of Harun al-Rashid, the great 1001 Nights caliph, his name was Ma'mun, and Ma'mun's mother was the daughter of a professor at, can we have the map just a minute, of this academy here at Jundi Shapur. I'll tell you about the academies in just a minute. And so he was a very interesting philosopher and intelligent man, Ma'mun was. He became caliph. And for 3 caliphs and a half the next one, rationalists controlled Islam. This scared the traditionalists to death. This scared the people who believed just in doctrine to death. So as soon as the 4th caliph after him changed in the middle of his career as caliph, Mutawakkil was his name, then they got control of Islam again. Immediately, in about 30 years, they finished all of that they hadn't been able to agree on in 200 years. They finished it in 30 years, and then they set it in concrete. Now, when the Muslims spread out of Arabia, they went first up to Damascus and Jerusalem here, and then they went over to Cairo, and then they went sort of like dominoes. some of the original Arabs would stop here in Egypt, and then new converts would go on to Libya, and then new converts, some would stay there, and converts. By the time they got to Morocco, there probably wasn't more than about 5 or 10% Arabians. But they crossed over into Spain in 707 at a rock called the Mountain of Tariq. Tariq was the general. Jebel Tariq, the Mountain of Tariq, Gibraltar. That's where that comes from. And when they got into Spain, they created one of the most intellectually powerful cultures in all of history. And it was an interesting culture because Christians, Jews, and Muslims all appreciated each other and accepted each other. They didn't tolerate each other. They accepted each other and celebrated the differences. So for about 300 years, it was the greatest flowering of Jewish culture in all of history was in Spain in the Arabic language. They wrote theology, Jewish theology in Arabic. They wrote poetry, love poetry, other kinds of poetry in Arabic. This was one of the greatest flowerings of Jewish culture in all of history in that period. So then the Arabs lost this because of the Mongol invasions and because they allowed dogmatists to take over. So from about 1300 until 1800, everything in the Arab world was memorized, and a very few people went to school. Very small percentage went to school. The literacy was probably 1% or less, but the Arab world was always highly literary. How can it be literary when almost everyone was illiterate? I can tell you why, because they memorized huge amounts of literature. When I first went to teach in 1950 in Ramallah, 12 miles north of Jerusalem, in a Quaker school there that the Quakers had founded in 1866, I had a group of boys in sophomore class, and on Friday, I assigned the first act of Hamlet. And on Monday morning, I assigned roles for everybody in the class and thought we were going to read this first act together so that they would have the sense of what it sounds like when you're doing it, an action. Halfway through the class, I realized they weren't reading. Everyone had memorized the whole first act of Hamlet over the weekend. I couldn't have done it in 3 months. But they're very great at memorizing. They have these fabulous memories. So they memorized all of that. Then, in all of that period, they were memorizing everything. Then came, in 1800, Napoleon. Napoleon came to Egypt because he wanted to annoy the British on their route to India, and he brought along scholars with him, and he started schools and so forth, and he brought Western curricula back to the Arab world. Now, the Arabs had passed all of this that I've talked to you about into Italy through Sicily, through Frederick II, who was Holy Roman Emperor as well as King of Sicily and King of Jerusalem, and that he built the first universities in the West, in Europe. And when he built them, they didn't have religious foundations in Europe, so he incorporated them, like the cities of northern Italy were incorporated so they could be sued and own property and so forth. And all of our universities have endowments and have independence. All of our academic freedom comes from the fact that all of our universities were incorporated from the beginning by the Arabs. Then the Arabs in Spain, largely through Jewish merchants, passed all of this literature and this discussion and all this knowledge, particularly Aristotle and the Greek thinkers, into Western Europe and the building of the universities at Paris and Oxford and Cambridge and so forth. So that all of this growth in knowledge and so forth had gone on way back in the 13th, 14th, 15th century. But in the Arab world, when the Western curricula came in 1800, the Arabs simply memorized Western curricula. And today, most schools in the Arab world still memorize Western-type curricula translated into very difficult Arabic. So it's an extreme problem for the Arabs. Now let's talk about what has happened to education in the Arab world today. In the time when I first went to the Middle East, about 12% of the boys went to high school. Today, over 80% of boys and girls go to high school. So this has been a huge expansion and a huge lowering of standards. When you expand that quickly, the standards go way down. It happened in this country in the 30s and 40s. My grandmother had a high school education that was better than the education I got at UT, I'm afraid to tell you. She could write a much better paper than I could, and she only went to Science Hill High School. But that was in the 1890s, when very few people went to high school and you really got an education. But in the Arab world, they've had this memorization, but there have been very bright spots in the Middle East. Some mission schools have taught people to think for themselves. And there's a school that was started as the Syrian Protestant College in 1872, the American University of Beirut. And the American University of Beirut has educated, not westernized, has educated the elite of the Middle East for 100 years. Now, of course, there's so many universities in the Middle East. When I went to Jordan in 1950, there was none. In 1955 and 56, they started a community college, two-year college. Now there are 34 degree-granting institutions in Jordan. There are over 1,000 new universities that have been built since 1960 in the OPEC countries like Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, and Libya. And a very sad thing I have to report. In those universities, they have all used the American University as a consultant on medical, on engineering education, on education, even business education. And AUB has always been lousy in it, business education. And yet not one of those universities has had a consultant from AUB in the broad general education that AUB gives all of its students, which empowers them to think for themselves. So people are going to universities in the Arab world and they're learning subjects, but they're not getting that combination of subjects which makes a broad general education. Now, remember that we went over those 10 things that they learned in those first few years. Rigorous translation of advanced ideas, disciplining a language. Why do we call things discipline? What discipline are you studying in, history or sociology? Why discipline? Because you're getting the very serious study by getting rid of all the extraneous and getting down to what really makes it work. The grammar, the use of grammar as for meaning, the origins of words, and then intercultural interests and contacts, and interdisciplinary, and history, problem solving, math, and honoring scholars, being really serious about learning, and discussions. I have just described the best broad general education, and it was discovered by the Arabs accidentally. They didn't intend that at all. And they must have understood what they'd done. But nowhere in the Arab world today can you get that kind of education in Arabic. American University of Beirut teaches in English. They taught in Arabic till 1901, but it was too difficult to get teachers who had to learn Arabic for 7 years before they could teach. So they went over to English in 1901. But no graduate of AUB has started a college or university in Arabic doing the same kind of thing in Arabic. So that's desperately needed in the Arab world. But we in this country have one big advantage. People in China and India are producing thousands of engineers, thousands of mathematicians. Have you heard that any of them have created anything new? No. And they won't, so long as they don't learn our secret of the broad general education. That broad general education is the base, and I've explained to you why, because it empowers people to think for themselves. And that broad general education is the advantage that America has in the whole world today. And we are not aware of that, and we are not emphasizing it, and we are not living on it. Now, many others in the West, in Germany and France and England and Scandinavia, so forth, also have that same broad general education. So what we need to do is emphasize in this country, emphasize it and emphasize it and emphasize it. A broad general education, a broad general education. That's what I want you to take away from here on the difference between modernizing education and westernizing schooling in the Middle East. Thank you. Are there questions? I'm saving most of my fire, as David says. It's embarrassing to make that film, but anyway, he said during the questions last time, I caught fire. So ask the questions, please. Maybe I'll catch fire again. Questions? Jack?
Well, I've been looking back over this remarkable book called Misquoting Jesus by the director of theology school at the University of North Carolina, Irwin, I believe.
A little louder, please, Jack, so people can hear
I've
me.
been looking back over this book called Misquoting Jesus about the problem in text, the original text, and there's just all kinds of difficulties in translating. And he's got one place in there he says that there are more, he doesn't say errors, he says there are more variations in the text than there are words in the New Testament. And I was wondering if you could amplify a little bit more about the problems of text and the developing religious thought in the Arab world.
Well, of course they do. If you're just repeating things that are written in Scripture, that's one thing. But if you're trying to understand it and interpreting it maybe within the own language, when you read something in English, try to interpret it into English that's simpler. You don't have to know a foreign language to be able to use this advantage of interpreting. It helps to know a foreign language because you get to see your own language and your own culture through different eyes. As I saw today, looking at that picture and realizing I use my hands like an Arab, as Layla says. But yes, it's a problem everywhere. But when you study something seriously and really try to get the meaning of it, what was meant, what context was it said in, why was it said, what does it mean to me? This is intellectually stimulating. And that's what we're looking for. You come to this university to be intellectually stimulated. You come also to get grades and to get a degree and so forth. But it's not going to do you any good unless you also learn to think for yourself while you're here. If anyone wants to leave, be sure and get, where are they, David? There are papers that we have. There are 4 pages for everyone. If anyone's a journalist or a specialist in this field that wants the fuller text, there are a few of those there too. So please be sure to take one of the papers with you when you go. But yes.
This is kind of in response to his question. There's a book which I believe is called The Aramaic Jesus.
Yes.
And it talks about translating, he translates from the Aramaic all over again.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me give you an example. We say, love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy faith, with all thy mind, and love thy neighbor as thyself. And everybody I've ever heard preach on this says that means you've got to love everybody else like you love yourself. But isn't what it says in Aramaic. In Aramaic it says, love your neighbor and also love yourself, as this is the hardest thing, as if this is the hardest thing. Loving yourself, I don't mean being selfish and self-centered. I mean really love and accept yourself as we hope God loves us. But this is the hardest thing to do. But that's a very simple example. Every preacher I've ever heard, actually, of course, everybody loves himself. Most of us don't love ourselves. Most of us would like very much to be somebody else, or at least a half a dozen other people. But this is a very good example of the language. See, Jesus didn't speak Hebrew. He probably read Hebrew because he studied to be a teacher, a rabbi. But he spoke Aramaic. Where did Aramaic came from? The Babylonians spoke Aramaic. When the Jews went into captivity in Babylon, they were there almost 100 years. When they came back, they didn't speak Hebrew anymore. So from 527 BC, no Jews spoke Hebrew as a living language until 1912, when Ben Yehuda rewrote it as a simple modern language, and the people who came out to form Israel began to speak that language. It became a living language again. For instance, they had no word for going to the bathroom. They had no word for atom bomb. They had no word for a lot of things. Most of those new words they borrowed from Arabic or Aramaic or Amharic, the other Semitic languages, the cousin languages. So, but the working of a language, when you turn in a paper, if your teacher turns it back to you, the teacher should make you rewrite it in as concise and precise a way as possible. After I got my PhD at Harvard, I went to Oxford for a year as a traveling fellow of Harvard. And I had Halls as my tutor. Halls was the man that started the International Baccalaureate. He was chairman of that committee. He was writing the International Baccalaureate at that time. And I wrote a paper. You have to write a paper every week for your tutor. I wrote a paper. When I got it back, he tore it to pieces like nothing had been torn apart since I was a freshman in college. He really tore it to shreds. And while I was a new PhD from Harvard, I thought I knew everything. But he really showed me that we use language very loosely in America compared to the English. The English want you to write precisely and concisely what you mean, nothing else. When I was teaching in China, I gave 12 lectures on modernization versus Westernization. I've been at this a while. And these were all translated into Chinese and published in a book. But before they were published, I had given them aloud, and I had given the text to the interpreter, and he had written it down in Chinese. And so then I had someone take that and translate it back into English. It wasn't at all what I said. And I found out that 3/4 of the mistakes were my English. I had not said exactly what I meant to say. I had said something casually near it, but not exactly and precisely. So we went over it through 2 other translations, and so it was fairly good. So the Chinese published it, the first book published in China by a non-communist in 40 years. I think at least 4,500 of those copies are still locked in a room somewhere. So if the Chinese get out that book and study it, they will know what they need, the broad general education they need to become creative. And then if the Chinese become creative, they are hardworking, they are disciplined, they're energetic, they will pass us by. So fast we won't know what hit us. They are really very hardworking and disciplined people. But so far, they're just memorizing things. Yes?
Thanks, Dr. I think it's a great outline, way to it might get a little sticky somewhere in history is in the days. I wanted to see if you could elaborate on exactly what you mean by history.
All right, well, in the paper you're going to get, it has sentences at least for each of those. This is just outline. But what you're going to get is a little fuller about each of those. But if you look at this, you will see a liberal arts education. The Dean of Liberal Arts can tell you whether that's what he would say is a liberal arts education. But we don't use the word liberal anymore because it's not a good word, especially in East Tennessee. But I use instead empowering education or modernizing education. But empowering education, I think, is better. Because that's exactly what it does. It empowers you to think, it empowers you intellectually, and it empowers you to be creative. But there's more of an explanation in the paper you're going to get as you go out. Anyone else? Question? Yes?
The original question about interpreting Scripture
Yeah.
brought to mind a difference between Muslim and Christian or Jews as well, in that the Muslims do have the original Scripture. They know what was written. Christians and Jews don't have that luxury. In each case, in the case of Christians, there are hundreds of years before we have any extant texts. For the Jews, there's a much longer period of time between the supposed writing of Scripture and the existence of written texts. So neither Christians nor Jews can really know what the Scripture is.
But to explain what he's telling you, the Quran was written down by 650. The Prophet died in 632. By 650, 4 copies were made under the Caliph Omar, and there are 2 of them still existing, one in Istanbul and one in Mecca. So there's very little chance that there's a mistake. In fact, there's some things that are written down. There are several letters that don't mean anything, but they have some kind of meaning in the Quran, but we don't understand what it is. But the New Testament was the first thing in the New Testament was written at 150, maybe 200 years after Jesus' life. And the church was already pretty well established and interested in establishing things for that. But in Sharia law, even the most conservative Muslim will admit that some of the hadith are convenient, that they might have been made up at the time. Yeah.
Doctored, actually.
Yes. Doctored. Yes.
How much do the Arabs owe to the Greeks?
Oh, tremendously to the Euclid's rigor in thinking, to Plato's discourse and his deductive reasoning, and especially to Aristotle. Because you may notice that almost all of the creativity of the Arabs was in science. The Arabs were great in science. Now, when Alexander came, do you have the map again? When Alexander came, he established in Alexandria, in Beirut, and in Antioch, and in Nineveh, near the northern part of Iraq today, and down here where the oil is in southwest Iran, at Jundisapur, he established academies. 600 years later, Justinian closed Plato's academy, 536. And the Neoplatonists went to the Alexandria, Antioch, and Beirut. The Neo-Aristotelians went to Nineveh and Jundisapur. And so the people in the East of the Muslim world are far more inductive and creative than the people in the West who are far more deductive and literal. But very definitely, and the Arabs always acknowledged their dependence on the Greek thinking, but they not only transmitted it to Europe. When they brought Aristotle back through Frederick II into Sicily and into Italy in the early 1200s, Frederick died in 1250. When he brought these things back, they had been forbidden by the church for 600 or 700 years in Europe. And so Aristotle, there was something very fermenting about Aristotle because it's inductive. They're always coming up with new laws, new rules, particularly in science. So those academies eventually became the centers of translation. Those academies were the first people the Muslims converted. They were interested in getting the intellectuals to become Muslims. And they became eventually the first universities in the world. And then they passed universities on to us. Yes, yes. A little louder, please. Yeah. when I was studying at Oxford in early 1970s, late 1960s, in fact, I studied with Halls. He was chairman of the committee writing the first International Baccalaureate. And so I didn't have anything to do with it, but I was working with the same man. And he's the one that tore my lectures, my essays to pieces until I rewrote it and rewrote it and rewrote it. I think my first essay I wrote no less than 8 times before he accepted it. And that's called the discipline of expression, being able to say exactly what you want to say as concisely and precisely as possible. Yes, David?
I wanted to ask you 2 questions. I wanted to go full circle back to the first lecture you gave in the Basilar series. When you met Malcolm X, the family that introduced you to Malcolm X, I was just curious, were they of royalty? And the second thing which relates to royalty, I know you recently missed a meeting with the royal family in Jordan, and I wondered, when you miss a meeting with the royal family or a royal family, are they offended?
Well, they can't be offended because it was their embassy that lost my passport. Or misplaced it for 2 weeks and claimed that the U.S. Post Office took 3.5 weeks to get my passport from Johnson City to Washington. But no, the people that introduced me to Malcolm X they were African American royalty. Ed Hope's father, John Hope, was one of the founders of the NAACP, and he was president of Morehouse for 40 years, the first person in this country to bring many blacks to this country to get degrees, to go back to Africa. And Ed was the highest colored man in the Navy in World War II, lieutenant commander of the Civil Engineering Corps, and he was dean of engineering at the American University of Beirut. And Malcolm X was very exhausted after his pilgrimage, and he wanted some place where he could rest, and he had been told by Alex Haley, who was then writing his autobiography of Malcolm X, that he could go to the Hopes and rest. So he went directly from Cairo to Beirut and went to their house and slept 36 hours before he could talk. And that's how I met him and talked with him. Yes, is there someone else before you? Someone else? Yes, Layla. And then I'll come to you later, okay? Yes, Layla.
Left my question till the end, I guess. I wanted to ask you about Socrates, because the method they used actually in the universities was the Socratic method. As the students sat and the teacher asked the questions, if you could answer, you answered, and that's what involved them. فرق الكلام.
Yeah.
Specifically Ikhwan Safa, which are the Neoplatonists that worked in Alexandria and
Yeah. But Socratic discussion, the teacher knows what he wants you to come to and asks you a question to lead you to it. In the open-ended question, the teacher goes along wherever the discussion goes. And that's a different thing and much more creative. You're right, the Socratic comes out of the Plato side, not out of the Aristotle side. Now, your question, please.
This may be hopelessly difficult, but do you see a resolution for the conflict in the Middle East, particularly relationship to Israel?
I try to stay away from that question because it takes at least a year to answer. I think I said last time, they've tried for 60 years to have a peace process. Enough already. We need to talk about a viable truce. No one in the Middle East, neither the Arabs nor the Israelis, going to sign anything that's permanent. So let's talk about negotiating a 20, 30, 40-year truce in which there's no killing. And during that period, the world has the opportunity to help both of these sides to learn to accept each other. Israel cannot continue to exist if it doesn't make peace with the Arabs. Now, how are we going to get them to do it? I have one good suggestion. All of the OPEC countries, 7 of which are Arab, and 9 of which are Muslim, they have 1/4 of the world's capital. Israel is missing the chance to do business with them. So that might be incentive enough to get Israel to sign a truce. And the Arabs, we can give an electric company to Gaza who has no electricity. We can bring water from the Nile in Egypt to Gaza who are negative water 40%, and you're having to get it from Israel who turn it off every time they want to pull the plug on Gaza. So there are lots of ways we can entice the Arabs and the Israelis to work together to discuss some kind of a negotiable truce. And that's my suggestion. But as far as I'm concerned, the only thing that keeps me sane with all the mess that's going on in the Middle East is I'm doing a project teaching discussion-based education, and now the Jordan government has it for all children, 6th to the 10th grade. We did it 6th and 7th grade last year, 8th grade this year. Next year, it'll be 9th grade and then 10th. But it's very difficult because the teachers have no idea how to lead an open-ended discussion. They still are dictating. They still are being authoritative. And what the minister has agreed that they'll get all the teachers to go through discussions with each other and then evaluate them. And that's the way they can learn. But there's not enough people that know Arabic that can teach that. So we need to sort of build it on its own, and that's what I'm working on. Yeah, someone else hadn't spoken, yes.
How would you compare the education in the Arab world at that time, like before the bombs attack, to Asia or China?
China has the same problem of memorization. I taught in China 2 years, 1979 to 81, back before we had an embassy there. And I taught in the National Teachers University. And they're very hardworking and very energetic, but they're still trying to memorize everything.
Did they ever have a time when they did the inductive reasoning? Like,
The Chinese?
yeah, like before the bomb.
They must have had, because they're the first to give us paper and glass and printing and all these things, but they didn't do it systematically. A lot of it was done accidentally. The thing that's been so great for us in the West for science is that it's a systematic way to look at the truths of the world, the natural world. That's the main value of science. Hypothesis, experimentation, observation, and conclusion. And that comes from Aristotle's, and it was brought in by the Arabs in the eastern part, Jundishapur and Nineveh. Who else? Yes, again.
Yeah, I'm interested in this idea of discussion as educators or if you're parents of kids or students.
Yeah.
How do we teach this discussion? Could you give us a way to give more information on how to do this?
Well, there's something called touchstones, www.touchstones.org. I'm doing Arabic touchstones and using Arabic text, but this gives you a text of 450 to 800 words, and you read it aloud, and then the children read it silently, and then each child tries to think of some idea or some question that occurs, and then they get together 4 or 5 from the circle, and every child says what their idea is, and then they decide which of those they're going to share with the group. Then they share those, and then the teacher asks an open-ended question, and they have a discussion for 12 to 15 minutes. And during that period, some of the students are outside the circle, and they're evaluating who spoke most, who spoke this, and drawing a diagram of where the speaking went. And was there interruption? And was there connection, alaqa, between the previous speaker and what you're going to say? It isn't a chance for me to jump up and start with something new. If somebody spoke, then I should have my talk be connected to that person's talk. Either agree or disagree or change it slightly. But a connection, there will always be a connection. This is how you learn to discuss. Children learn it at the table if parents discuss wisely. And they learn it by being asked questions that get them to start discussing. Be sure to get your papers as you go out. There's a question back here. Right, yes?
I know that the Queen of Jordan has been instrumental in modernizing their educational system.
The whole school system in Jordan is being revised, because before that, it was a British 1920s colonial curriculum, badly translated into very difficult Arabic, because when somebody translates Arabic, they always have to show you how erudite they are, and so they write it as difficultly as possible, because good Arabic is difficult Arabic, and simple Arabic is bad Arabic. So, but Queen Rania is working hard on it, And she's the person I was going to be meeting. Her assistant is a former student of mine. And we'll be talking about, she's been supporting the Touchstones. And it's her pressure on the ministry to change education, and the curriculum division, who are the most religiously, who I was working with, a prayer rug on the back of every chair in the division. They picked up mine and incorporated it. It was absolutely accidental. It didn't, the value of it, they didn't have a program and they were being forced to do something original, and they picked this up. Yeah.
To extend that, do you think that diplomacy and conversation between the countries that will end up with a resolution to the Middle East crisis?
In about 50 years. I told the Minister of Education that this is going to change the way people think in the Middle East 50 years from now. And I'm planning to be here to see you do it. And I think he's scared I will be. I'll only be 132. 133 now. Someone else here had, yes.
I just want to make an iota worth of difference. It seems to me that the plan you outlined will lead us back from mastery, where we spend so much time in American education thinking we've mastered something, back to mystery that underlies all these things. If we are Socratic solely, we end up on a mastery track where only certain things are acceptable. And that's where we are largely in American education right now. But if we go on that Aristotelian track, then we end up with appreciating other views, even if they're not in the status quo.
Especially if they're not. Especially if they're not.
Yes.
Yeah. That's what I'm proposing. Yeah.
I think that kind of thinking would lead us back to the mystery that underlies all the mastery that we have. And we tend to think that, as in our testing, whether it's in Tennessee or some other state, that once we get that minimum requirement done, we have done something wonderful. And in some cases it may be wonderful, but it's still a minimum requirement, while we could be going so much farther.
Yeah, and the much further is hard to test. That the most important things in education are difficult to test.
Summarize what he said.
All right, he said that Socratic education just simply follows the line of getting more information and more knowledge and becoming masters and experts and specialists. And that's the direction American education is going in. There needs to be that mystery and that uncertainty and that excitement of learning something new, which comes from Aristotelian learning. Did I translate that? Yeah. But now, when I was running for Congress 4 years ago, I started Touchstones in Sullivan County. It's still going, and we're going to try to revive it and spread it, and we're going to try to spread it to Greene County. I think if every single child in America had discussion 1 hour a week for 1 hour only, open-ended discussion, we could change the education in this country for very little money and without threatening anybody's curriculum or anybody's bailiwick. And I'm working on that, and I hope if I live long enough to get it going in all of 1st District, Tennessee. Dolly Parton started with getting everybody to read by giving a book to every child from every month from birth to age 5. The Touchstones could take it on from there and get them to discuss what they read, and that will open up all kinds of things. And I don't know where it would lead, but it would lead somewhere. And that's the important thing, instead of just trying to sort of retool what we've already done or go over and over what we've already done. If you and this younger generation, and thank you, the younger people, very much for coming. I appreciate your coming, because in previous talks we haven't had many young people. If you can't be better than we are, we're going backwards. And the whole purpose of being a teacher is to educate people to surpass us. So if you're going to be a teacher, keep that in mind. Your job is to get your students to surpass you. And so those of you who are my students in here, I hope by the end of the year you'll be able to outthink me on all of these things. That's my aim. Yes?
but I taught 30 years, and I think I would like to see what you think about. I came up with a metaphor of the playing coach to teach. I think there's a place for lecture and discussion, and I don't think discussion by itself will do it. I think there has to be a sizable amount of lecture on the part of the one that's supposed to know, the teacher, but they need to go together, I think. But I'd like to know what you think.
Well, that's true. I hope lecture. I've always been a lecturer. I didn't learn that nobody learns anything. Very few people learn much from my lecturing until I was over 60. So I've been working on discussion education. But remember that the Abbasids had research, discussion, memorization, research, discussion, empirical observation, inductive reasoning, hands-on science. That's more of the balance. But I'm doing the discussion because that's what I'm trying to work on. But I have a hard time discussing because I talk too much. Yes, please.
Okay, when you discuss memorization, are you implying that being a college student getting an education, they are jaded by the concept of degree and they aren't trying to
A little louder, please.
do you think that people are jaded by the concept of a degree and so it puts a hindrance on their just intelligence, growing as people, learning about the world, because they're trying to memorize just to get their degree?
Well, you have to do both. This world is set up so that you've got to have a degree, particularly if you've got to teach. But you have to know that that's not the all of education, and certainly not the end of education. I remember once my ex-wife said, "Why are you reading? You finished your education, you got a PhD." Stop reading, stop learning. I hope I'm going to be learning until an hour before I go. I'm planning that at 120, incidentally. My grandmother used to say, "Only the good die young." She lived to be 97, and I'm not meaner than she was. So maybe it'll be 120. Yes, in the back.
During the Enlightenment period, all over the United States and most of the world, how much of their learning was derived from the Arabs, not just the Greeks?
A lot of the Enlightenment was a result of the kinds of thinking of Aristotle and Euclid and so forth, the combination of the Greek, which the Arabs sent forward to us, and the Arabs improved on it to some extent, particularly in science and so forth. But the Arabs didn't do the greatest science. The world didn't do it until after Descartes. And when Descartes brought the rigor, the real intellectual rigor, to science, then it took off. Around, I always say the beginning of the modern era and the era of science was 1642. Why? 1642 was the year Galileo died and Newton was born. And to help you remember that date, it was also the year that Harvard graduated its first class. Can you believe that all of science has come since Harvard started? That's kind of daunting, isn't it? 1642 is the date I use for starting. But a lot of it did come not just from the Arabs, it came from the Greeks and on through the Arabs, and all learning in the world, it benefits from other learning. We build on the shoulders of those who go before us. Other questions? Have I gotten to 8? Yeah, I'm past 8, yeah. Thank you very, very much. All of these lectures can be found on iTunes, iTunes U, ETSU.
Do you want people to continue to talk to you?
Yes, if they want to. Just say it into here.
Yes.
Say it. Look, I've got this on. Just say it. Say it if you want.
Okay.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you very much.
You're very
I
welcome.
really enjoyed this.
Good.
And I hope to come back and hear more. You're going to do more?
No, this is the last lecture of the Baszler series. I'm going to do all 4 of them over again in Kingsport, Wednesdays at 1:30 at the Public Library.
I'm a teacher, so I can't
Yeah, I
be
know.
here,
Okay.
but
But they're
I will
all.
get your